online session of the 2019 R&D and CARMA Doctoral Student and Junior Faculty Consortium. As you know from previous sessions, my name is Thomas Kreckemer, and I'm this year's chair of the consortium, and I welcome you on behalf of my colleagues and track chairs of the consortium, Joanna Campbell, Jose Cortina, and Sanjay Cheng. And today's topic we're dealing with is advances in data analysis approaches, and we have assembled an exciting panel of experts who will speak to us about three topics on this in this stream on advances in data analysis approaches. We have Jan Dull from the Rotterdam School of Management with us here today, who will start our panel off and will speak on necessary condition analysis. And Jan will be followed by Pina Oskan from Warwick University, who will speak to us on qualitative data analysis of single, comparative, and multiple cases. And then last but certainly not least, we will have Sam Hunter from Penn State University, who will speak to us on historiometric analysis. And after he gives his presentation, he will, in the questions and answers and discussion phase, also be joined by Matt Crane, his co-author and colleague on this work. In terms of the format, we will proceed in our usual way. We'll have 30 minutes allocated to each of our panelists. And after the panelists are done with their presentations, we will open up for questions and answers. So when we get there, please use the Zoom chat function to send in the questions for the panelists, and we'll use these questions for our questions and answers and discussion part. And in the unlikely event that with this format, or somewhat unlikely event that we will have some time left at the end of the session, we will open up for a question and answers period with all three of our panelists. So thank you again very much to all three of you, or all four of you, for being here today. And without much further ado, I'll turn over to Jan Dull and to his presentation on necessary condition analysis. Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you, Thomas. Okay, I will open my slides. Do you see them? Okay.
Yes, so, Jan, you'll just want to do the display switch real quick.
Sorry?
You'll just want to do that switch of the display settings real quick. There you go. That one.
Like this?
Looks great.
All right. So thanks, Thomas, for inviting me for giving a presentation, an introductory presentation on necessary condition analysis. And this is a new method that has been proposed in 2016 in a paper in the Organizational Research Methods. And since then, there have been quite some developments and quite some applications of these methods. And I would like to, the next 15 minutes or so, to say a few words about where we are. So necessary condition analysis was developed because necessary conditions are everywhere around in our real life. For example, in today, having an internet connection is a necessary but not sufficient condition for attending this consortium. If you wouldn't have an internet connection, you wouldn't be able to do so, to be here in this event. But if you have the internet connection, you may or may not attend this consortium event. So a necessary but not sufficient condition. Another example from business, we see it in a lot of business areas. Management commitment is necessary but not sufficient for organizational change, for example. Without management commitment, we cannot have a successful change, but with the commitment, we may or may not have a successful change because also other factors contribute. So this is the idea of necessary condition analysis. It uses a different type of causal logic. We are used to traditional logic like additive logic and average trend logic. there we see that the single determinants, can have an average effect on the outcome. And those determinants can be compensated for each other. If one is not there, another can help to increase the outcome. So we see here a regression. And an x1 can increase the y, but also an x2 can increase the y. But if x1 is absent, then still x2 can increase the y. So we can interpret the regression equation as an equation with factors that are sufficient to increase the outcome, but they are not necessary for increasing the outcome. And the necessity logic is the other way around. Here we look at a determinant as something that is necessary, but not sufficient for the outcome. And they can't be compensated if absent. If a necessary condition is absent, you will not have the outcome, independent of all the other factors. So that's a typical new way of looking at causality. So in NCA's data analysis, we usually start with a scatter plot. And here you see a scatter plot about the relationship between sociability of a person and the sales performance of salespeople. So what we normally would do if we want to see if there's a relationship between the two, we draw a line through the middle of the data. We draw an average trend line, an or less regression line in this case. And this indeed tells us that sociability has on average effect on sales performance. But in necessary condition analysis, we draw another line. We draw what we call a ceiling line, a line on top of the data. And here you see two ceiling lines. One is a step function connecting all the upper left corners. And the orange one is one that is a trend line through those upper left corners. So it is a ceiling line, and the ceiling line represents necessary but not sufficient logic. That goes as follows. On the left side, you see that the ceiling line is represented now as in tabular format. Sales performance on the left and sociability on the right column. And when, for example, you want to have a sales performance of 90%, which you see in this the red line to the right, I will pick my pointer now. So if you want to have a sales performance of 90%, you see that you must have a sociability of at least 73%. If you don't have that sociability, then you will not be able to have a sales performance of 90 or above. But at the moment that you do have this level of sociability, you may or may not have that high level of sales performance. So this is an example that a 90% level of sales performance is only possible if you have at least a level of 73 of sociability. You can look also at other points on the ceiling line, for example, this one. If your ambition is to have a sales performance of 70%, then the required level of sociability is less, it's 23%. But if you have a very mediocre level of sales performance, if that is desired, then sociability is not necessary anymore, because even without sociability, you can have high or medium levels of sales performance. So this is the type of analysis for necessary but not sufficient. So in necessary condition analysis, we formulate a couple of parameters. The first one is the empty zone, which is this space. And the empty zone is called the ceiling zone. It's not always empty, as you see here. In just a minute, I will tell you why. We have a total zone, which is the scope. And the effect size of the necessary condition is defined as the ceiling zone as a fraction of the scope. So it can be between 0 and 1. And we have also an accuracy measure, and that is the number of points that are above the ceiling line, or below the ceiling line. In this case, you see 3 points above the line. So the accuracy of the 100 points that are here in the scatter plot is 97%. And the reason that these points are above the ceiling line is that this is the trend line through the upper left corner. So it is not a perfect line from the point of view of emptiness of the upper left corner. So what we try to do in the analysis is to figure out the empty spaces in the upper left corner. And if this empty space is small, we call it a small effect. And if the empty space is big, we call it a very large effect or a large effect. Actually, the size of this empty space is an indication of the constraint that X puts on Y. The lower the ceiling line, the higher the effect size, the more the constraint X puts on the Y. So that's why we call it an effect size. Separately from the effect size, we also calculate the p-value, a statistical test for NCA, because the empty space can also be caused by just random result of two variables that are unrelated. So in order to avoid this, that you make a type 1 error, a false positive, we also have formulated and developed a p-value for necessary condition analysis, and that has just been published in organizational research methods. It's in press here. So when we apply NCA, we have a couple of assumptions. First of all, an assumption is that there are good data. You need a good sample, a probability sample, if you want to infer from the sample to the population. It must be representative for that population. You want good measurement, valid, reliable measurements without measurement error. Also, one single study you always want to replicate because a single shot study is never conclusive. But all these assumptions, these assumptions also apply to any data analysis method. It also applies to regression analysis, for example. So when you see an empty space in the upper lower corner of a scatter plot, you may want to conclude that it might be due to a necessary condition. But you need to have a couple of conditions for that. First of all, there must be theoretical support. It must be a reasonable size of the empty space. For example, it must be at least 10% of the full space, the total space. And you want it to be not random, so that it is statistically significant with a reasonably low p-value. So you could consider these three requirements as necessary but not sufficient conditions that an empty space could be interpreted as a necessary condition. It's not sufficient because still it can be a random result, still it can be caused by other factors than necessity. So when you conduct necessary condition analysis, you take four steps. The first step is to formulate your necessity theory. For example, your necessity hypothesis. X is necessary for Y. Then you collect your data on X and Y. You analyze your data with this ceiling technique, and then you write up your study. And in the next fall of this year, there will be a book on necessary condition analysis that goes into the details of each of these steps. Let me give two examples. The first example is an example from collaboration between two companies in order to improve innovation performance. And the question here was, do contracts and trust are both necessary? Or is one necessary, the other not, or are both not necessary? The current theory says that there are two different theories. One says they are both needed, and another theory says they can compensate for each other. So this was a study published in 2016, which was one of the first studies of applying necessary condition analysis. And here you see three variables that were considered to be potential necessary conditions: the level of details of the contract, the competence trust, and the goodwill trust, so two different indicators of trust. And because there's an empty size here that was also statistically significant, it was like that it could be concluded here that these are probably necessary conditions. So they cannot compensate each other, contrast and trust. They each must be there if you want to have a high level of innovation performance of the collaboration. For low level, it doesn't matter. They're not needed. Interestingly, each factor contributes on average also to innovation performance, as you see in the green or less line. But apart from that, they are also necessary. The second example is an example from entrepreneurship. So what activities are needed for later success of the firm? And one of these activities is, for example, having a business plan. And the question in this study was, are those different factors, different activities, not only important, according to the current literature, but are they also necessary? And the answer was in this study, none of them is necessary. They help to increase the probability of performance, but they are not necessary for performance. For example, you can, without a business plan, you can still be a successful firm. You see here the scatter plot. It looks a little bit different than the ones that we are used to, and that's because here the x can have only two values, 0 and 1. And because there is a point in the upper left corner, it shows that this is an example activity, that this activity can be very low and still you can be successful. So this is an example of not finding a necessary condition, but still being able to publish it, because then we can see that the different activities can compensate for each other. You're not single activities that are necessary. So these necessary analysis can be theoretically relevant in the sense that we have a different type of relationship between the two variables. It is not that X helps to produce Y, but X allows that Y can exist. And that's why instead of putting a plus or a minus above the arrow, we put there NC, necessary condition, on the arrow. And because the necessary condition operates in isolation from the rest of the causal structure, the necessity is independent of the other variables, we can have very parsimonious theories, very simple theories in which there is only one or a couple of axes that we can test for having a necessity relationship with Y. This analysis is also practically relevant, because if you find a necessary condition, then you can advise practice to make sure that it is implemented. Because if the necessary condition is not in place, there will be a guaranteed failure of the outcome. It makes no sense to change other factors that influence the outcome, because the necessary condition is not high enough. It is a bottleneck if it is not in place. And another important thing is that this necessary condition, when it is absent, cannot be compensated with other conditions. And that's all because this necessary condition works in isolation from the rest of the causal structure. So why can applying NCA be a contribution? And there are a couple of reasons. First, it can give theoretical insights with simple models, new insights, necessity relationships, critical factors, crucial factors, etc. It gives very practical results if you have found a necessary condition. And also we have seen in the last couple of years that there are a lot of publication opportunities. And most of the published NCA papers are standalone papers in the sense that only necessity analysis is used, but there are also examples of papers that use NCA in combination with other methods. We have seen applications in nearly all areas of business research, and also outside business research in the social sciences and even in the medical sciences. It's relatively easy to use. As you saw, it is a bivariate analysis or a multiple bivariate analysis. You draw the ceiling line, you calculate the effect size, and you do a statistical test, and you can already have an indication of a necessary condition. Because the method is very new, we support potential users with the method. We have a website where here you see the website address. There's an R package to do the analysis for you. We have a calculator on this website And as I said, there is also a book upcoming on how to conduct the analysis. There have appeared some social media pages where people discuss about the methods in a newsletter from time to time. And we are present at workshops at a major conference, like the next ones is the one in Uram in June 27. We are at the Academy in August, the British Academy in Management, and also in the Strategic Management Society in, I thought it was October. Yes, in October in Minneapolis. So in short, yeah, why not try NCA on your data set, in existing data sets or new data sets? Most likely, also in your area of research, you will have necessary conditions. Now, this is a statement from Cary Kurtz. He was one of the first thinkers about necessary conditions in political science, and he phrased a law, what he called a law, for any research area one can find important necessary condition hypotheses. Okay, so I'm open for questions and for answering your question.
Jan, thank you very much. And we are opening up the floor now to questions from consortium participants. As a reminder, please use the Zoom group chat functions here to post questions for Jan Dul and send these to everyone. While we are waiting here for questions to come in from the audience, Jan, perhaps one. No, actually, there's one already, so let's go right away here.
Okay.
How is the ceiling line determined? And is that created in the R package?
Sorry, Thomas, I missed it. Can you repeat it?
The question is, how is the ceiling line determined, and is that created for the user in the R package?
Yes, the ceiling line is created in the R package. There are a couple of alternative lines. I have shown you two, the step function and the regression line through the step function. And the step function basically is an existing type of line that is used in operations research as a frontier line. And yeah, it is a common line that is considered to be the line that is best fitting the data when you're looking for those empty spaces. So yes, it is provided in the package, and more details about this line are in this core paper that was published in 2016.
Next question here, how do you confirm that you have enough data and variation to be confident in a necessary condition finding?
Yeah, that is always a difficult question. When do you have enough data to be confident that you have found an effect? I think that applies to any data analysis method. What we can do with a relatively small number of data is to falsify a necessary condition. Even one single case in a deterministic view on necessity, even one single case in the upper left corner could falsify your necessary condition hypotheses. So yeah, the little bit obvious answer is that you need at least one case to do one test of necessity, but preferably as much as possible. There's no optimum level of number of cases. I said one case, and that's one of the reasons that necessary condition analysis has also been used in qualitative research, in case study research, where usually there are only a few cases available. But you can falsify with a successful case whether the condition was there or not.
We have another user's participant's questions here, who asks about his, I believe his observation, that there are differences between NCA and QCA, that they're very similar. So he or she asks what the difference is between the two. Yeah.
Okay, I can imagine, Thomas, that you also have that question as an expert of QCA. There are the logic, the necessity logic is basically the same in QCA, but they are very different in goals. The main goal of QCA is to find sufficient configurations, and sometimes a necessity analysis is done as well. but the necessity analysis is done in a different way. QCA uses set theory and uses binary algebra, and NCA is using regular variables and not membership scores to do the analysis, and is using linear algebra, the same algebra as in or less regression, for example. Also, the type of results from QCA and NCA are different. QCA can only find what we call necessary conditions in kind. A condition is necessary or not. Whereas in NCA, because of the ceiling line, we can formulate for which level of Y, which level of X is necessary. And this is what we call necessary conditions in degree. There have been 2 publications on the comparison of NCA and QCA, so you could look at the website, and there's those publications are listed there.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. And in the interest of time, I would like to move on to the other questions here as well. One participant asked here about your thoughts about how NCA can be combined with other methods, which are the most important suitable that could complement NCA?
Yes, I do think the regression analysis and the QCA indeed. So if you can complement NCA with QCA by adding more insight in the necessary conditions based on an NCA analysis, and could add that to the analysis of QCA for additional and more detailed necessity insights. You can use NCA in combination with OLS to figure out not only the average trend of a factor, but also to figure out if this factor might block the outcome if it has a value that is too low. So what I usually see is that there's not a real integration of NCA with QCA or with OLS regression, but it is a complementary approach in which you draw different conclusions with let's call it the traditional method, and with NCA. So I would see them as complementary and answering different questions.
Mm-hmm. There's one more question here. Is there a book or a seminal paper, perhaps one of those shown, that can be used to learn more about conducting NCA? And this may be an opportunity to refer to some of your work on NCA.
The connection was bad, Thomas. Could you please repeat the question?
And you also see it in the chat function, by the way. Is there a book or seminal paper that can be used to learn more about conducting NCA?
Oh, yeah. There is this book that I put on the slides. This is a step-by-step, actually we pinched at the master level, but any newcomer in NCA can use that. And there you go step for step. You can see how the analysis does. Again, I would suggest to go to the NCA website, to the publications. There are methodological publications about NCA. There's also critique on NCA. There are also replies to the critique on NCA. So you get a feel about what is the methodological discussion. And there are about 30 or 40 papers that have applied NCA in different areas. So my suggestion would be just to read papers, and you will get a better understanding of what it does and what it can't do.
We have one more minute. Jan, I'm going to ask you a question here, in regards to one of the examples in your presentation. We're referring to one of the published papers where you noted that researchers looked at trust, and the other one was competence, I believe, as contracts, yeah, as necessary conditions. And you noted that the findings showed that they were both necessary. So my question here is, in very brief, when I think about a research setting where there may be conditions that could be related to one another conceptually, that could be correlated with one another. And then when you analyze them as necessary condition analysis in isolation, and they both appear based upon the evidence you have as necessary, what is the theoretical and or the methodological process of identifying any potential redundance between necessary conditions?
Yeah, I think the starting point of any necessary condition analysis should be theory. So you should have a good theoretical reasons why you think that a certain factor is necessary. It could be that that factor is correlated with another factor. And then in the necessary condition analysis, the factor of interest and the correlating factor that might be not of interest would also show up as a necessary condition because of the correlation. So therefore, you need to be guided by theory to figure out what is the realistic solution here. Mm-hmm. So no analysis without theory, and I think that applies to most observational studies.
Very good. Well, thank you again very much, Jan. And in the interest of time, I would like us to move on to our second panelist of today, to Pina Özkan, and her topic on qualitative analysis of single, multiple, and comparative analysis.
Wonderful.
Pina, all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Let's share. And can you see my slides?
Yes, we see your slide.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so hello everyone, and my name is Pina Özkan, and this is a completely different topic. So if you are doing both quantitative and qualitative analysis, this may be quite nice to hear different approaches. And I myself do qualitative research almost exclusively. My background is that I was trained at Stanford University together with Kathy Eisenhart, and I do qualitative research in the areas of strategy, entrepreneurship, technology, markets, change management, and a lot of that I do in the format of single, comparative, or multiple cases. So my key research projects, which some of them have been published, some of them are still ongoing. The one where we looked at different startups looking at looking to publish mobile games back when mobile games were first starting in the early 2000s. Those papers, the first one in AMJ and the second one in SMJ, have been published with a multiple case method. Then the mobile payments paper is actually has a different approach. It has an embedded multiple case design, and what I mean by that is that there's a global market that we look at, which is the mobile payments market. But within that, we have individual country cases where we compare and contrast these cases and to try to figure out why the same service would take off in one market and not so much in the other market. So that's what I mean by embedded. There's one large market where we consider the development, but with individual embedded country cases within that. Sharing economy is another current study where I look at different sharing platforms, for example, car sharing platforms, looking at their growth opportunities depending on whether they do peer-to-peer versus they get their own fleet. And there's quite a bit of platform theory in there, but the method is, again, multiple cases, comparison between 4 cases in this particular case. And finally, open banking, where the idea is to look into different fintech firms, the way that they enter the market, whether that's in competition with banks or it's in collaboration, or whether they switch strategy in between. And that requires kind of lengthy interviews and a qualitative multiple case study. I'll get a little bit more into these examples as I go on. I wanted to first discuss with you how I think about writing a single or multiple case qualitative paper. And in particular, what I would like to focus on, and obviously, we're going to talk quite a bit about data analysis, but I think that designing the study itself, even knowing what you're going to do in terms of single versus comparative versus multiple case is also quite important. And within that, what's sometimes confusing is to actually know where you go with that. And I want to start out with comparing the three options that are typically available. So, the single case study, we have the legendary, this is the one that I read as a doctoral student, the Nikolai Sigelkau's Liz Claiborne study of how, the corporation was kind of first going up and then declining. And it's a fantastic paper. And there have been other examples since. And I myself have written, together with Melissa Graebner and Suho Han, we've written a chapter on single case design in the Routledge Handbook for Qualitative Analysis. And what's nice about single cases, by the way, is that it allows you to look at an unusual phenomenon, something that you wouldn't expect, and something that hasn't been accessible to researchers before. You can imagine the Mangold example with Carl Weick, and other examples of interesting phenomena either at the organizational level, or it can be at the department level, it could be at the industry level. And if you think about it, a lot of industry level studies end up being single case, because industries are difficult to compare anyway. And, going into one single case allows you to focus your attention and observe that case longitudinally. Typically, going in for a snapshot in a single case is not a good option, because you don't have a whole lot of the richness of what's going on and how that phenomenon changes. And of course, because you have all that information, without access, you can't do that. Then you end up having a much richer case. If you have access to a single case, it's usually nice to use that. However, I must say that single cases are, compared to the other ones, naturally face the threat of so what question a lot more than the others. So with single cases, thinking about generalizability, how that applies to other companies, why we should study this would come up. And there, it's quite important to think about that from the beginning. And one way to maybe get around that is to turn the single case into a comparative case, to try to find a case that directly compares, even if it's in a different industry. But obviously, it needs to be very well justified. So comparative cases are quite interesting. I've done one comparative case study where we looked at the same service coming into a market. It's a technology. It's a broadcasting service, pay TV, and what we looked at was one that had a different technology, which was over-the-air technology, no cables required, and then the second one was cable TV. And as you know, cable TV is very widespread right now, particularly in the US. And we looked and asked ourselves the question, why is it that over-the-air TV, pay TV didn't take off, but cable TV actually did, whereas over-the-air was much cheaper and much easier to do. And we found out that it was a lot about the entrepreneurs' framing and collective action activities, and we were able to document that and create a comparative case between these two technologies, which came to the market around the same time, one of them slightly earlier than the other one. And we were able to look at that within that same context, two types of efforts, although each of them involved many entrepreneurs, two efforts, and how one of them was successful and the other one wasn't. So in terms of replication, comparative case is obviously stronger. Therefore, you can talk about generalization a little bit more. And it also allows you to still show a lot of the richness of the data, which is great. At the same time, what I would say is it's actually important to still think about generalizability beyond these two cases. So, for example, in that pay TV data, we struggled a lot with reviewers in terms of, so what does this apply to? And the answer to that was, okay, these are new technologies coming into a market. They are different technologies that have different regulation implications. And the context is that depending on how that technology fits the regulatory context, what the entrepreneurs can do and should do should differ. And so we were able to generalize to that level by using the technology angle. But this is something that's always needs to be thought about. Finally, a lot of my studies are multiple case studies, and the idea is to think about how to compare either organizational units or entire organizations. So for example, I do a lot of comparisons of startups, either, as I said, in the sharing economy space right now, or also in the fintech space. We can also think about, for example, you can compare alliances between firms, and you can hold one firm constant and then look at the alliances around it and then compare that to another one, and etc. So multiple cases allow you to do many different combinations of these. What's nice about multiple cases is obviously that generalizability is quite high, but at the same time, it's a lot more difficult to get the story right? Because there's so many different things that vary. And there, in terms of design, I think what's important is to understand, first of all, if you're in the space overall of kind of organizational theory, strategy, entrepreneurship, it's important to really understand what is it that, if this was a quantitative study, what would be the dependent variable? What are we trying to understand there? And so, for example, one thing that I struggle with right now with my fintech study is that because these fintech firms are all quite new, and a lot of them don't even have many subscribers, many consumers that are, using these apps, the obvious question would be, which one is more successful? How can we tell? So, for example, one of them has, several subscribers. The other one has much less or much more. But one of them is making a lot more money potentially, but I can't really compare because one of them is, is doing something completely different, right? So a fintech that gives loans versus a fintech that kind of helps you manage your finances overall and gives you advice, completely different things. So it's important to not compare apples and oranges, and as part of that, it's good to, in the design itself, and I think that's already my next slide. In the study design, it's important to, as you build your sample, to think about what is it that I'm going to let vary and what is it that I'm going to hold constant. So, for example, within the same sector, founded in the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever it may be, a certain size, if that matters, operating in this particular context or another, that it's international versus not. So there are many things that you end up comparing, and almost always I end up having many more cases, potential cases, than I end up with, because I don't know yet at the beginning what I'm going to hold constant and what I'm going to let vary. And so, for example, in the fintech case, we ended up looking at B2B versus B2C business model as one of the things that we wanted to hold constant. So we ended up choosing 4 fintechs that started in B2C, but half of them actually switched to B2B later on, and then another 2 that started with B2B, and we were able to kind of have a nice sample where we saw both, and we wanted to see why some of them went into B2B from the beginning and what made others switch, etc. Right? So building the sample itself is not easy. And there, obviously, there's a lot of patience involved and cold calling and emails. In terms of the specifics of how to approach companies in order to use them as cases, what I try to do is, first of all, before I get into some advice, the first thing I want to say is that in that chapter that I mentioned in the Routledge handbook for qualitative research, we give quite a bit of advice on how to approach companies and kind of what to say and how to follow up, etc. So there's a lot of practical advice if you're interested. But in addition, what I would say is that something that I see a lot in my students is that they can get the first interview because these guys are interested in having to listen, having to see what do you have to say. But after that, it kind of falls off the radar and they basically don't respond anymore. And for that, my recommendation would be already start data analysis with the little data that you have, so that you have something to show, some preliminary emerging findings to show to get back in the door, right? So typically what I do is I say, based on my preliminary analysis, I'm happy to come in and make a presentation to your team. The advantage of that, obviously, is that then they bring more people around the table, and I make a presentation, and then I meet these people and I ask more questions, and I get their business cards, and I keep following up with that. In terms of collecting the data, it takes a long while, as you know, to collect qualitative data, and per case, the minimum would be 2-3 interviews, but potentially more. And if it's going to be longitudinal, then you need to have more than one interview per wave. And so typically in my studies, I would have 3-4 waves. So you end up reaching like 80 interviews, 100 interviews, whatever in total. And there's also a lot of supporting interviews. And so it's a long project, and especially those of you who are just starting your academic careers, or those who are who have just started it. It's important to know that qualitative studies of this scale take several years to publish. And I myself ended up doing a lot of these at the beginning, and it took me a while to get published. So, for example, there was a 6-year gap as an assistant professor where I actually couldn't publish anything, because either I was collecting data for one project or it was under R&R, etc. And that's a long time of not publishing. And so I would say that having 1 or 2 qualitative studies that are kind of these long shots, big projects is great, but I think you need to probably also hedge your bets and do other things at the same time. Now, finally, what I want to also talk about is the way that analyze the data. And here I see 2 approaches. What I have been trained with is the Eisenhardt method of going in depth into cases. What you do is you have your interviews, you have them transcribed, and you actually do that preferably yourself within the 24 hours after the interview, because if the audio somehow fails, you end up having kind of remembering still what was going on. And based on that, the next step would be to code the interviews based on some of the themes that you see. And here I start already a table design where I start with certain themes, and I kind of dump all the quotes that I see from different interviews into these different themes. And I do several searches with keywords in order to see. And in this process, I use NVivo quite a bit, which is good as kind of to get organized. It doesn't really do any analysis for you, but it's good to use that tool so that you can quickly search something if you need to. And in terms of presenting these, then the idea will be that you build your story, and then these tables will be your supporting quote tables later on. In the Joya method, what you do up front is a little bit more complicated, potentially, because you have the first order, second order, then the aggregate dimensions. But what I see is that the reviewers, especially reviewers who are not as familiar with qualitative research, are quite more sympathetic towards that, because when you present that table of first order, second order, and aggregate, it actually looks quite a bit more systematic. And but what that requires is that from the beginning you actually start to code certain themes, and then typically at the very right, the first order would be very case specific, context specific themes. And then in the second one, it will be not context specific, so already going into the theory, like what are some of the theoretical constructs. And then finally, on the very right of that, the aggregates would be about kind of things that these conditions have an effect on, right? So it's a good exercise, and I think that nowadays I do both a lot. So I actually start with understanding the story with the Eisenhardt method, and then in order to present the paper before actually writing it, I go into and apply the Joya method as well. And the presentation of data with qualitative research is also something that's important. And here in particular, as you analyze your data, you have a story, and that story can be told in many different ways. And especially in a lot of cases, the qualitative research is also longitudinal. And when you present it chronologically, typically the story gets told very well, and people really kind of fall in love with your story. The problem is that because the theory comes within the chronology itself, a lot of times reviewers will say that this is not theoretical enough, whereas the theory is embedded in there. And on the other hand, if you organize it around theory and put lampposts in terms of, okay, so this is this stage, and this is this stage, and this is what happened, and then if you can link that with a figure that shows your theoretical framework, that typically gets absorbed quite a bit better by these kinds of reviewers. But there, of course, the struggle is that the story gets a bit lost because you're completely rewriting based on the constructs. So what I typically do is I do a very brief summary, almost like a one-pager chronological summary of the story at the beginning, in order to get the readers familiar with the context and with what happened in general. And then I start to tell the theoretical story, saying, okay, this is this is what they did first. And this is the theoretical construct based on that, and then here in the theoretical our framework, which is in figure 1, this is the second stage, and in the second stage, etc. So a hybrid is usually something that I'd like to work with. And so overall, kind of this is what I wanted to share, and I think that I'm already a little bit over time, so maybe this is a good time, Thomas, to open it to questions. Yeah.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much, Pinar. And again, please use the group chat function here to respond to post your questions. Well, I'll ask one brief question until we have some questions coming in here. Which is one of the topic we had last week actually was different approaches to longitudinal data analysis, and you also referred to some of your work being longitudinal. Just if you have a few ideas that you could share in terms of the role of time or different possible roles of time in research science to make the case studies longitudinal. That question makes sense?
Not yet. So the role of time in what sense? How much time should pass between your waves of data collection, or how do you treat time? Or
what the role of time is in terms of why you make case studies longitudinal, and the different purposes, if you will, that time can fulfill.
Okay, yes. So typically what we're looking for when we're doing it longitudinal is change. Right? And so there, it could be in the case of entrepreneurship research, for example, it could be that you're looking for how these companies are growing, and or some of them are failing. Actually, during our longitudinal data collection, one of the firms that we talked to actually filed for bankruptcy, which is great for our purposes because it shows that something was going wrong. And in general, I think that what happens is that if you're studying anything that is an organizational process, and as we all know, qualitative research is great for understanding processes that quantitative research cannot really get into. It's quite good to go back and kind of talk to these either firms or to organizational units every few months. And of course, one of the dangers there is that where do you cut it off, right? Because you could go there for 5 years and you would learn interesting things. You keep learning interesting things. And here I tend to be quite cutthroat. I actually, I may go back to them to still follow up because another story might emerge. But as soon as I have enough data for one interesting story, I start to go and write it up. And then as soon as that is written up, I go back there to present it in order to maybe, get a bit of kind of sound checking. But other than that, I would say that, following change. And then as soon as you see enough change over time, then go to write, because otherwise you'll be in there forever. So we have one question here.
Yes, that's right.
Is it difficult to publish single case study research compared to multiple case? And is there a preference towards the latter? So in general, yes. I think multiple case study research, once you do it well, is easier to publish. it's more difficult to do it well because you need to make sure that the comparison makes sense. And I cannot tell you how many studies I reject as a reviewer or as an editor based on having compared apples and oranges, or just the unit of analysis not matching the research question, right? And so there, I think that if you have a single case, then your trouble is whether you can actually get enough theoretical abstraction in order to make a theoretical contribution, go beyond the story itself. But I would say that if possible, if your case is not an anomaly, but it's an interesting case, then you might want to compare it to something, either to one other case or multiple other cases, depending on the feasibility of the research project. Yeah.
Very good.
The second one is you conduct more macro level qualitative research. I'm more steeped into micro level. Wondering how you think conducting quality at these levels differs. So yes, I think that in a sense, I find the micro level qualitative research a lot cleaner. It's a lot because you can tell, okay, these are, this is my group, these are the individuals that I'm going to talk to, this is one unit, I'm going to compare to another unit at a different company, but these units are the same in many ways, they're both R&D teams, etc. So it ends up being quite a bit cleaner. Whereas if you go in and say, I'm going to compare Germany to France, it ends up you need to do a lot of thinking about many contextual factors. So macro level is potentially a bit more messy, but in my opinion, the contributions that you can have for how industries develop and how new products come into markets, etc. There's just a lot you can do in terms of contributing to particularly innovation and entrepreneurship research. So that's why I do it and continue to struggle with it.
Okay, next question.
When do you typically during the process of data collection analysis come up with ideas about the outcomes of interest? I try to do that quite early on because it affects the questions that I'm going to ask. So for example, if I'm going to look at how they're switching between business models, I want to make sure that I go deeper into that process in order to make sure that I understand that. And but even before talking to these firms, what I do is I do quite a bit of archival research together with my either PhD student or RA in order to have a table of comparison for different factors. So for example, before going to a fintech firm in order to study them as a startup, I know how much money they raised, how many people they are more or less based on because they always say meet the team within their website, and whether they won any awards. And so I have performance proxies so that I can actually compare them to one another. And once I start to hear their stories and ask questions about the general topic that I'm interested in, then I start to see, okay, these are some of the interesting factors. And a lot of times that you need to make that decision early on, such that you can have a more guided study, because you end up otherwise having 6-7 interesting stories, but stories that don't really match because you've asked ABC here and XYZ there. Or they told you that because you asked a general question. So you need to focus pretty, not at the very beginning, but already with the second interview, you need to focus quite a bit. And one last one regarding multiple cases that I heard that Dr. Eisenhardt believed different researchers could reach the same findings using the same data. Yes. So yes and no, in the sense that if they were if they were trying to answer the same question, I think they should be able to reach the same findings. And that's the beauty of the multiple case comparison, because as we just said, if you know what you're as an outcome interested in, it should be pretty clear to show that, say, for example, in the very simplistic sense, these 3 firms failed and these 3 firms survived. Or one of them did really well. It was acquired for $1 billion, which was one of the cases in one of my studies. And another one is still at 5 people and, in this little garage in San Francisco. So there's a clear performance difference. And in order to, and once you know that, and once you know what story you're going to tell about that performance difference, then it should be pretty comparable. And that's why it is more systematic. And that's why reviewers like it a lot more. But at the same time, of course, listening to the same story, different researchers might find different things interesting. So based on that startup's story, I could tell probably 5 different stories for 5 different papers. I probably won't get 5 papers out of that because they won't be able to, I won't be able to hone in on all those topics. But depending on what your inclination is, so for example, I look at competition and collaboration a lot. For some reason, I find that fascinating, like that you might go into a market and then get some partners to work with, but at the same time, your goal is to actually compete with them in the long run, etc. Those things are fascinating to me. So I end up kind of getting into those topics more and more in my different projects. And then that's my lens, in a sense, which you develop after a while because you start to realize what's interesting. And so again, yes, they should be able to reach the same outcomes, but different researchers might be able to tell different stories where the outcomes are the same. Yeah.
Very good. Well, great. Thank you very much, Pina.
Thank you.
And everybody, please feel free to use the group chat function here to shout out to Pina Özkan for a very interesting presentation. And in the interest of time, I would like to move on now to Sam Hunter and historiometric analysis. And Sam, the floor is all yours. And as a reminder, when Sam is done with his presentation and we have the question and answers, he will be joined by his colleague and co-author, Matt Crane, to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Thomas. So the sequencing here is quite perfect in a lot of ways. Pinar's work flows really well into the discussion about storymetric analysis that I'll talk about today. They're, I think, a nice complement to one another, and they'll overlap enough that you'll hear some consistency, but also I think they're a little unique, and so there'll be some things to learn on both sides. So like I said, I'm going to talk about historiometric analysis today. Before I jump into what historiometric analysis is, I'll give you a few resources to take a look at, and a special acknowledgement to my co-author, Matt Crane, who put out a great ORM paper last year on doing historiometric analysis in organizational sciences. Historiometric analysis and historiometry is actually not entirely new. It's quite old. It goes all the way back to Francis Galton, Catherine Cox. Dean Simonton in social psychology has used it for 30, 40 years. And more recently, we've used it somewhat in the leadership literature, but it is fairly new in the organizational sciences for some of the reasons that I'll talk about as I walk through. If you're interested in the topic, I think these are 4 great papers to start with. They're threads that you can pull on and get a little deeper into later, but they're good starting points if it's at all of interest to you. So what is historiometric analysis? I think the best summary is that it's content analysis of curated data, and there's a couple things to unpack with that statement. It's a form of content analysis. It's a type and a subset, and I think there are some unique aspects that make it novel in a way, but it is a form of content analysis and has all the benefits and drawbacks that content analysis has. One of the things that makes historiometric analysis unique is that it is curated. And so the most common form of historiometric analysis is a biography. So, a book written about an individual. Sometimes those books are written about groups. Sometimes they're written about other entities. And there are other forms of historiometric data like obituaries. But the biography is the most common form. And when you think about what a biography represents, someone or a team of individuals did a ton of research and a ton of work, synthesized, aggregated, decided what to keep in, what to take out, poured over their writing, thought about what to include. And so all of that effort and work ultimately led to you having that book in your hands. And so that curated aspect, when you're doing analysis on that specially selected, those specially selected sources of data, brings a whole host of benefits and a few drawbacks as well. But that's essentially what historiometric analysis is. You're putting numbers to this qualitative data. From a sample size perspective, we're not talking as much about 1, 2, or 8 cases. We're typically talking about 100, 150 individuals, sometimes with multiple events that are coded within there. So a bit more on the sample side. Still some of the rich data, but not as much as some of the things that Pinar described. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to try to get you excited about historiometric analysis in two ways. One is the sort of the broad benefits of why historiometry is a useful tool for your toolkit. And then the second one is sort of a personalized story of why I use it and continue to use it in my research. Broad benefits are some of the things that you'd already likely thought of. It's difficult to get access to a number of data sources. Leaders are the most common example. It's tough to get leaders to give us information. They're busy. They have a lot of gates around them. So getting access to them can be difficult. Using historiometric analysis lets us look at 150 world leaders in ways that you couldn't do otherwise. The data are also quite rich and deep because they're inherently qualitative. You're able to understand context. If we give out a survey, those participants are usually gone to the ether once the survey is over. With historiometric analysis, when we get our numbers back, we can then deep dive back into the data if we so choose and understand context. When biographers write biographies, they're storytellers, and so that context matters. That's what story is. It's understanding that when I talk to a subordinate and a subordinate talks back to me, these are all happening within a broader context, and biographies typically capture that pretty well. There's also the longitudinal aspect. Most biographies will follow a sequence of early life events, peak of power events, and then decline from influence events. And so you're able to see, not from necessarily from a causal perspective, because it's still correlational data, but from at least a longitudinal perspective, the growth and arcs that individuals may have over time, which is also a nice benefit. The personal story is way back when, once upon a time, as a graduate student, I was tasked with doing a bit of leadership research. The dominant paradigm of thinking about leadership at that time was transformational and charismatic leadership. The conclusion seemed to be the best way or most effective way to be a leader was to be transformational and charismatic. And on some level, the data suggested that. It didn't quite sit well with me that that was the only way. And lo and behold, the work that my advisor and some of the graduate students were doing at Oklahoma using historiometric methods started to paint a picture that when they looked at successful, outstanding, incredibly impactful leaders, not every leader was transformational or charismatic. Some were more pragmatic, some were more ideological. And so this idea of equifinality emerged from that work, with the idea being that there was more than one way to be a successful leader. Had we kept applying more traditional and typical survey-based methods to studying leadership, that discovery of equifinality, that observation that there's more than one way to be successful, would not likely have emerged in such an impactful way. There was the pre-thinking about leadership in my mind, and then after thinking about leadership in my mind. The pre came before understanding historiometric analysis. I didn't think leadership was all that interesting. Because of historiometric analysis and that genuine opportunity for discovery, I got excited and dedicated at least half of the research that I do to understanding leadership. Had it not been for that method, I would not be studying leadership. I would have found it not particularly interesting. And so that method really did, I think, allow for genuine discovery, and that excites me, and that's in many ways what I'm talking about things today. All of that is to make a pretty, I think, solid pitch for why I think it's important and useful and a good tool to have in your toolkit, but why might you not want to do that? And there's a number of drawbacks. It's hard. It's incredibly labor intensive. It takes a lot of upfront work. It takes years to do, and that labor comes at a cost. The data are also correlational. You can try to make some inferences on causality, but not particularly strong ones because of the nature of just the way the data are structured. It's also not as well established in OB and IO at the time, or as of right now. And so as a result, you may send in some of this work and you may get pushback from reviewers about concerns over were the authors biased, or the raters biased. Those are some of the more common criticisms you might get. I found that over the years, most of the reviewers tended to be pretty positive, but because it's not as common, you never know quite who you're going to get as a reviewer. And so it's always a risk that you run. You do all this work and then you send it off and you have somebody that's not familiar and not a fan of the work. You're also limited to individuals or phenomena that people write books about. If your book or if your phenomenon isn't worthy of a biographer putting the time to quantify that, it's tough to use a storymetric analysis to study that phenomenon. I think another way to weigh whether or not this is a useful method for adding to your methodology tool kit is to think about the different steps that it might take to do a storymetric analysis. We lay out 10 different steps in the paper that we put out in 2018. Take a look at that if you want to see things more in depth. I'm going to summarize those just to give you an overview of how a typical storymetric analysis project might go. That'll give you an idea about whether that's of interest to you. Early on, I think this is some of the most fun work. It's really about exploring whether or not you want to do the study. And the best advice I can give is to read some books. Grab a couple biographies, take a look. Is the phenomenon that you want to study able to be quantified? Could you go through and make a code book that would capture some of the things that you're interested in? Is it inaccessible because of the nature of the way that biographers describe the phenomena, or do they talk about it in great detail? And it's this phase that I think you shouldn't rush, because once you start moving into later phases, that's when the labor and the work kicks in. So know early on whether or not I think it's has utility, and spend time on the front end to save you on this stage where things start to get much more intensive. So once you've made the decision to jump in, all the pragmatic issues start to kick in. You start asking yourself about the data sources that you're going to use, the code book that you're going to set up. You have to refine that code book once you figure out whether or not people will be able to code those things or not code those things. You might have to edit benchmarks or other aspects to help ensure that you're having highly reliable coding. You have to decide whether or not you're going to select certain parts of the chapters or certain events. If you're going to make those decisions, who makes those decisions and how. The storymetric analysis is front-loaded. This is the front-loaded, heavy lifting part of doing a project like that. And so it's going to take some time. Once you have that done, you hit the execution phase where folks start their coding. You've got your multiple coders engaging in deep dive on the material that you've selected and the variables that you selected using the codebook that you created. Your coders need to be trained. You also need to manage coder fatigue. I would recommend weekly meetings. There's a tendency for coders to push things off to the end, and when they do that, we all do that if we're allowed to. And if we do, we start to rush things a little bit. And so getting deliverables on a consistent basis stops that giant push at the end where data can get muddied as a result. It requires you setting up and executing those meetings, but it pays off in the long run, I think. And once the data are in, you actually get to perform your analyses. The analyses will vary based on the kinds of data that you ultimately collected. It's a very flexible approach to managing a project. So you may do something as simple as a set of ANOVAs because you're just comparing group differences, but you also may get much more complicated depending upon whether you're looking at different events and you're tracking those over time. And so the nature of the analysis will really be dependent upon the kinds of data that you collected in your research question. I think the thing that makes the storymetric analysis particularly unique and really exciting, and it's my favorite part of doing a storymetric analysis, is once you get some of those numbers, those quantitative numbers, you can then go back into the qualitative data and ask yourself, is this really what's going on? The numbers say X is related to Y. Is that what's happening in these qualitative data? It also allows you, and I think this is one of truly the biggest benefits of storymetric analysis, is once you find this relationship between X and Y, and it tends to make sense, is to pull out examples and illustrations to show your reader, to show the consumers of your information what's going on. You get to storytell. I don't think we do a good enough job as researchers telling good stories. And storymetric analysis really allows you to pull out these wonderful illustrations that do permit, I think, really interesting and compelling storytelling. It's the kind of work that I like to read, and over time, I've seen folks really like this work as well. So I've been doing this for about 15 years or so now. There are a few tips I would offer should this be of interest to you. If you're going to go through the effort of doing a large-scale project, pulling all the biographies from the library, carrying those across, scanning everything, getting all of it sorted and put together, excuse me, I think you should plan on multiple projects if you can. You have to be careful about separating variables, of course, and keeping everything ethically distinct from one another. But it's a lot of work and a lot of effort, and if you can get 2 or 3 papers out of that, I think there's utility in it, as long as you're clear and open and honest with the publishing process. It's going to take longer than you think, usually about 20% longer, so plan for that to the extent that you can. Don't jump in without understanding that it's going to be a lot of work on your end. I don't recommend it for a thesis. I recommend it for a dedicated dissertation. Matt can talk about that a little bit. And then the last point is make sure you have a great set of coders. We're really lucky at Penn State to have an amazing group of people who do great coding and do great work for us. And without them, we couldn't do this kind of work, and we're able to do it because of them. So I'm grateful, but that also takes a commitment on your end as well. Historiometric analysis and the future is an interesting question. We're actually exploring how some of the lessons learned and methods may be applied to different forms of curated data. So we're working on some shared leadership work this summer, and we're going to basically ask the question if we can use things like documentaries, podcasts, docuseries, and apply the lessons learned and basic methods from content analyzing biographies to content analyzing these alternative data sources that are becoming more common and also give us access to people that are sometimes inaccessible, but they also bring with them a new set of challenges. Podcasts, for example, are edited but less curated, and so what applies and what doesn't? These are questions we're going to be exploring this summer. So I think, there's an exciting future extending some of these things, historiometric analysis, to different sources of data. Wrapping things up, and then I'll turn it over to Matt, or at least open it up to Matt to answer any questions that you might have. I genuinely think that historiometric analysis allows for discovery in ways that other methods may not. I like to have all sorts of methods available to me, but I see a lot of value in the potential for inductive discovery using methods like this, qualitative analysis broadly, but historiometric analysis in particular. I think the ability to go back into your data and take a look at the richness and the context is invaluable, and I found it to be invaluable over the years. But I also think the ability to be better disseminators of information, to take what we learn quantitatively from a numbers perspective and make that come alive through examples and illustrations, multiple examples and illustrations, is invaluable, and it's something I think we should strive to do more of to the extent that we can. And I think with that, I'll open it up for discussions with Matt as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Matt is coming in here now for handling the...
That's a tough question to go to Matt.
Apparently, the tough question. So please use the Zoom group chat function here again to get in your questions on historiometric analysis. We have 2 experts here, and I'm sure together they will be able to crack your questions. So while the questions are coming in here, I'll just offer one question here. Could you help us to situate historiometric analysis in the spectrum of content analysis techniques, or how is it specific in terms of content analysis?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. It's one that actually came up in the review process for the paper we put out in 2018. How is historiometric analysis different than content analysis? And I think Sam alluded to it a couple of times in his talk, but we actually don't position them as different. So instead, content analysis is broad, it's sweeping. It covers the whole scope of text or not empirical data source use in research. So instead, we position historiometric as kind of a package of specific techniques within content analysis that can be used for answering very specific questions. So from the training and database and material collection points all the way through analysis, all of those different things have been done within the umbrella term of content analysis, but historiometric analysis is a specific approach to that process.
Great, thank you. We have a first question here from a user. Can this type of analysis be used for constructs beyond individuals and their qualities?
Well, hopefully I understand that question the right way, but I think so. The big advantage, and from the kind of distinguishing between common content analysis versus historiometric, one of the huge advantages to historiometric analysis is the application of context and the idea that we can use expertise and expert raters and informed theory and prior research to figure out what constructs of interest we have. And so that does not just apply to the individual level. Most of the research that we've done to date has looked at individual differences, leaders, artists, exemplary individuals. But if we wanted to code for contextual or environmental variables at the firm level, for example, or team level, I don't see any reason why that would be different. It would still be informed by theory and prior research and expert rating of that context. We just take a different lens to how you think about the material you're looking at.
So you really
follow up
leadership because you're interested in this specifically to demonstrate, right, in the ORM paper how to use this. I'm sorry, Sam, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say we have published papers looking at group level and organizational level phenomena using historiometric analysis. We compared violent and nonviolent groups, and so there are historical accounts of these groups, like the IRA, a violent ideological group versus Mary Kay, who is a nonviolent ideological group, and making those kinds of comparisons at the group level. So there have certainly been examples and illustrations applying that to things beyond the individual. We just study leadership, so that's where our lens tends to be.
Great. We have a question here could you tell us a bit more about how to code data from autobiographies? I think this could be a very useful question to give participants here a little bit more of a flavor on how you code data.
Sure. So, well, actually, I would say that autobiographies would not be the types of data we would be looking for. So another key difference between the way we approach historiometric versus some other content analytic techniques is that historiometric relies on sourced third-party narratives. And this is a way we can avoid bias in the data. So part of a problem in content analysis is thinking about whether or not the information you're getting from your source is accurate or is inflated or censored in some way by that source. When we look at things like academic biographies or historical journalism, things that are created by well-sourced third parties, we actually can avoid that, right? So thinking about academic biography that compiles a lot of sources rather than autobiography would be the way that we would think about it. But in terms of coding in general, you can take multiple approaches to coding depending on what your research question of interest is. Sam mentioned the difference between event-based coding, which is, am I interested in things that happen during the course of this person's life, right? Incidences of turnover or job change or conflict, versus chapters, thinking about how time progresses and this person grows or changes over time. When you make those determinations on how you want to structure your research question, that gives you some framing for how to go into the data, how to read the content, and what variables you're interested in. Then it's simply thinking about what are the relationships of interest, how can I operationalize those constructs, and then whether or not I can identify those operationalizations reasonably within the text information. And that's, Sam mentioned, what we would essentially label as some piloting, which is going out saying, this is my question of interest, these are the variables I think are important. Can I find representative data about this within the context of a biography, for example? If the answer to that question is yes, then we can design a coding structure that allows us to systematically go through either those chapters or identify those events, and then code around the context, identify context within the language of the text that indicates whether or not the variables of interest are present, right? And issue codes for those depending on what you're interested in.
Great. So here's a question on how you evaluate the sources that you're going to work with. So what are some criteria used to determine whether authors are reliable or well-sourced?
That's a really good question. some people, particularly academic biographies, are often written by people with a history. So sometimes, a good place to start is saying, I'm interested in John F. Kennedy, for example, as a person of interest. I find an academic biography of that person, and I see the biographer, has this person written things in the past? Is the biography well sourced, right? Do they have a references section that seems complete? You can also tell by writing. We train coders on how to read the way that the authors write about events or about people, to see whether or not they're interjecting opinion. For example, if they start talking about a particular event and you're going pages and pages and pages without adding a citation, right? Similar to the way we critique potentially a research article, it might be trending more towards conjecture than towards evidence. So we're trying to take that very empirical approach to criticizing the way that somebody writes about a topic of interest. There's always a risk when you're working with information that somebody else is composing. They're going to inevitably put their kind of spin or bias on it. So an additional approach there is you can use triangulation, which is identifying multiple sources that cover the same person or topic or period, and then seeing if they generally report on that thing in the same way. If you've got really wide differences between sources, then there's probably some bias or some misunderstanding between the two. But if everyone is looking like they're pretty much in agreement about how something happened, in the case of a historical event, you can be pretty confident that the information you're getting is free from most bias that would be relevant to your research question.
So next question here will be whether we can go as far as picking up self-development books from professional experts and using those for content analysis.
You can technically use anything, I guess, that's a text-based source for content analysis. The question is whether or not that information is going to, A, be relevant to whatever your research question is, and B, be from a source that you can trust has that type of source, that honesty within the source that we would expect. That's really what's important there, is understanding that the people that are giving us this information are doing it without an agenda. They're not trying to pitch something or sell something, sell an idea, sell a product or whatever. If there is something like that that's out there, if that's relevant to your research question, then there's no technical barrier to it.
Yeah, very good. So start with the research question in the first place. We have, I asked one question until there's, sorry, this was answered. So a question here that I'm going to throw out in this forum, most of our participants are doctoral students, some junior faculty as well. Do you have any advice for them in regards to the need for coders? You emphasized in your presentation that there is, if I could paraphrase it, get an army of coders for yourself. What if that is not an option in terms of the resource availability for doctoral students, of what's possible for them? Any advice for doctoral students?
I can speak as a former doctoral student who did historiometric analysis in my dissertation. We did have an army of research assistants. That was very helpful. Sam mentioned this before. This is a very labor-intensive method. It would be not reasonable to have one person do it. It also would be, statistically not a good idea, right? We want inter-rater agreement and things like that. So you always want multiple coders to be working on these projects. If you're not able to get access to a group of people, it doesn't need to be 10, but 3 to 5 people to work on this project over a period of time. I would reconsider whether or not it's an undertaking that you want to take on. You're looking at very large samples, lots of reading. I mean, it amounts to potentially tens of thousands of pages of work. That's going to require a lot of effort. So I would think about ways to get, undergraduates that are interested in your research, or potential, offer your fellow graduate students potential co-authorship on a paper for helping you walk through work through the data collection process, because that is really the hard part. And that's it's probably the only obstacle that's one you can't really get around when it comes to historiometric. You simply need people and time in order to get it done the right way. The worst thing you could do is go out on an endeavor like this, not have the resources that you need, spend all of the time putting the data together, and then have it not be what you need it to be. So making sure you have the infrastructure up front, even though it's difficult to do, graduate students are creative. I'm sure they'll find some way to get the people they need.
Great. I think that's a very good ending point to this realistic assessment of the resources needed. So thank you very much, Sam and Matt, here for this excellent co-presentation and question and answers session here. Please, again, for everybody, feel free to use the group Zoom chat function to shout out to Sam and Matt for a very informative presentation. This also concludes our session today. So I would like to close by again thanking Sam and Matt, as well as Pina and Jan for excellent presentations and for presentations that together I think made for a very informative session that gave us a flavor of quite different approaches, and so enriched our understanding of thinking about data analysis approaches. And as we're closing for today, I also would like to shout out again to thank Larry Williams and Andrew Hanna for being there in the background and being there for us and making everything work and all the technologies work. So thanks again for today's presenters, and next week we will be back for our last session with a panel of individuals who have quite a bit of editorial experience, and we will tackle the question of clearing methodological hurdles in the publication process, and we'll have an Ask the Editors session. So thank you again very much, and have a good rest of the day and evening.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.